Well, good evening. Good evening. Thank you. I'm Purdue CIO Jerry McCartney and director of the Dawn or Doom conference. You're very welcome to this year's Dawn or Doom event, Dawn or Doom 2017, a very imaginative title. We've had wonderful first day of thought-provoking presentations today, which only serve to remind me of Woody Allen's remark that mankind is facing a crossroad. One road leads to despair and utter hopelessness, and the other to total extinction. I hope you choose the right road. But whether technology is leading us to nirvana or disaster, the topic has certainly been good for this particular event. This is our fourth year of Dawn or Doom, each year bigger and better than the previous year. We expect more than 6,000 people to attend this time, with participants from every college on campus. And we're particularly happy this year to partner with Liberal Arts Big Read Project, the Ecological Science and Engineering Symposium, the art exhibit from the Dublin Institute of Technology, Cranit's Business Intelligence and Analytics Center Data Dive competition, and Design Good Now, which is sponsored by Purdue Industrial Design and the Weldon School of Biomedical Engineering. You'll see each of these partners' events in our schedule. Please feel free to drop by and visit. They'll be delighted to see you. Over all this, though, we're very pleased that this topic strikes such a chord of interest for so many. Purdue is a global leader in almost every area of innovation and the technology enabling that innovation. We think it's important to have these discussions about what happens when these innovations move from our laboratories to the real world. So when Mitch Daniels first proposed an event to discuss these topics nearly 5 years ago, it seemed a natural thing to do, and we've been happily dawning or dooming ever since. So now we come to tonight's keynote presentation. Michael Bess was fascinated by the character Data, an android constantly striving to be more human-like in the television series Star Trek: The Next Generation. Professor Bess set out to write a book about artificial intelligence and the possibility of machines achieving human-like personality traits. But he soon realized that emerging technological developments in biology presented some even more pressing issues. The result is his book, Our Grandchildren Redesigned: Life in the Bioengineered Society of the Near Future. This future may include the ability to live healthful, vigorous, mentally clear lives for decades more than we do now. If we're not careful, however, it could also include the emergence of a biologically based caste system, where some people can afford to live longer and stronger, while the poor get left behind. Michael Bess is the Chancellor's Professor of History, a Professor of European Studies, and Associate Chair of the History Department at Vanderbilt University. He is a specialist in 20th and 21st century Europe, with a particular interest in the interactions between social and cultural processes and technological change. He's received numerous awards for his scholarship and writing, as well as for his teaching. Among other things, he teaches undergraduate courses on World War II, the history of environmentalism, and the societal and moral implications of human bioenhancements. His other books have included Choices Under Fire: Moral Dimensions of World War II. He is currently working on his next book, which will examine human nature and human personhood, integrating the most recent findings of the natural sciences, medicine, and engineering with the state of the art in humanities and social science. It is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Michael Bess.
Thank you, Jerry, for that very generous introduction, and thank you all for coming out this afternoon. I'd like to begin with a somewhat provocative assertion. I'd like you to think of the most popular science fiction movies that people watch nowadays. Movies like Star Wars, Spider-Man, the Hulk, Iron Man. All these types of movies paint a vivid picture of a high-tech future, but I'm going to argue that they've actually been misleading their audiences in an important way about what the future is going to look like. They have one profound fallacy in common, and the fallacy can be summed up like this. In the future, the gadgets and machines will get weirder and weirder, the technologies will get more and more powerful, but the humans will remain absolutely the same as they are today. Our technologies will evolve dramatically and even radically, while we humans will stay fundamentally the same. And so I call this the Jetsons fallacy, after this popular TV show from the 1960s that tried to imagine what the world was going to be like in the 2060s. They were imagining a century ahead. I'd like to just give you some other examples of this fallacy at work. And I think once you stop to actually examine it, you'll be surprised at how prevalent it actually is when our culture thinks about the future. So in the Star Wars films, we certainly do encounter many intelligent robots and alien biological species and some not so intelligent biological species. But all these strange beings coexist alongside a population of unmodified humans who are no different from the humans of today. The human heroes and heroines of Star Wars constantly use and interact with advanced technology, but they themselves, their bodies and minds, are almost never transformed by technology. And the only exceptions are telling ones. Darth Vader is a cyborg, a person who has undergone a gradual, incremental transformation until he becomes more machine than human in some ways. His redemption at the end of the story comes with the symbolic removal of his prosthetic helmet. I'm sorry if that's a spoiler for some of you. Revealing once more the scarred but still recognizable human core underneath. And the underlying message is not ambiguous. Humans are humans. They should not be technologically modified. Bad results will follow if they are. And we can see the same thing in other examples, the popular TV series Star Trek in various incarnations. Series exhibits exactly the same phenomenon. Now, you may be thinking, wait a minute, what about back in the 70s, the $6 Million Man, the Bionic Woman, more recently the Hulk, films like Inspector Gadget, Alien Resurrection, Spider-Man, Iron Man. Now, in these films, it's true. We do encounter humans who undergo profound biological or bioelectronic modification, but it's always under the same conditions. Whether it's accidental or deliberate, the modification is uniquely confined to a single individual. It never applies to the surrounding population. And it's true, there is one big exception, Aldous Huxley's 1932 masterpiece, Brave New World. Now that does stand out as the single most important exception to this trend that I'm describing. Huxley's imagery of bioengineered castes, drug-induced manipulation of the masses, has penetrated very deeply into contemporary culture. But what's striking is how unique Brave New World remains within the subset of science fiction works that have become cultural landmarks, in the sense that everybody sort of knows about them. 8 decades have passed since its publication, and it's still the only systematic effort to imagine a world populated by engineered humans. What are we to make of this phenomenon? I think the answer lies in the economics of mass appeal films and books. Movies like Star Wars, Star Trek, Iron Man, these are designed above all to entertain, to sell lots of tickets, DVDs. They're supposed to beguile us, not freak us out. The technological modification of entire populations of humans is not a fit subject for mass entertainment because it's simply too disturbing to contemplate. If it has to be confronted at all, it has to be refracted through such categories as alien, rare exception, dystopia. it must always be coupled with the assurance that even in the most extreme future, ordinary humans will still exist, will still continue to be what they are today. Now, the only problem with this comforting picture of the future is that it's probably not true. It suggests that many people in today's society are living in a state of denial, psychologically unprepared for what is actually far more likely to become the case. If I were laying bets on what the historians of the year 2300 will say about our society, looking back and discussing the primary distinguishing features of our era, I would single out the rise of biotechnology as one of the leading candidates. Why? Because biotechnology is giving us the capability not just to change our world, as we did in the Industrial Revolution, the early 1800s, but to change ourselves, to manipulate and redesign our own bodies and minds. Through the use of pharmaceuticals, we are learning how to control our moods, boost our physical and mental performance, increase our longevity and vitality. Through the application of prostheses, implants, and other bioelectronic devices, we are not only healing the blind and the paralyzed, but beginning to reconfigure our bodies, enhance our memories, and generate entirely new ways of interacting with machines. Through genetic interventions, we are not only neutralizing certain diseases long thought incurable, but opening up the very real possibility of taking evolution into our own hands, redesigning the human platform, so to speak, of body and mind in a thoroughgoing way. Let me just briefly sketch what's happening today in the three major areas of enhancement science: drugs, bioelectronics, and genetics. I'm also going to draw dotted lines into the future, extrapolating from current trends and asking, what might these phenomena look like around the year 2075, perhaps a little later, 2100? Obviously, none of us has a crystal ball, but I'm relying here on what the experts themselves in these fields, the scientists, the doctors, the engineers, what they have said about the plausible directions their work might take over the coming decades. In the category of pharmaceuticals, the first one is going to be the physical traits, which will be open to more direct and more potent sculpting than ever, probably with fewer side effects than today. Cosmetic and functional enhancements will allow us to override some of the limitations that biology and luck impose on today's humans. If we so desire, we will be stronger, faster, more coordinated. The world of competitive athletics, as this slide implies, will have to adapt. It may even have to devolve into a two-tiered system with separate sports events for the enhanced and the relatively unmodified. I say relatively because all of us are slightly modified, but I'm talking about the difference between slightly versus very modified. The chemical manipulation of human cognitive abilities through drugs like Ritalin, modafinil, will spread beyond college campuses and become part of everyday life for many people, whether they like it or not. Chances are, however, that a majority of individuals will like it very much indeed, and will come to consider the chemical boosting of mental performance perfectly normal and acceptable. By mid-century or thereabouts, we may have the ability to use chemicals in fine-tuning our emotional states with unprecedented degrees of precision. Three factors will render this emotional modulation possible. First, our ever-deepening understanding of the functional architecture of the human brain. Second, our clearer grasp of how brain chemistry correlates with specific mood states. And third, our increasing ability to intervene precisely with chemicals targeted at the molecular level to modulate brain states and hormonal functioning. Put these three together and you have emotional modulation in a very precise scale. Aging will still occur, but we will probably be offered new products that dramatically slow down the deterioration and attenuate its effects. The average lifespan, but more importantly, the average health span of the population will continue to grow. People will live longer lives, remaining physically and mentally youthful for much longer than today. Some aspects of our physical and mental profile may even prove amenable to moderate forms of systematic rejuvenation. We may be able to dial back the clock in some regards. The second, that was pharmaceuticals. The second area of human enhancement lies in the field of neuroscience and its intersection with various technologies such as prosthetics, robotics, informatics, and artificial intelligence. This is what I mean by bioelectronics. Let me give you an example of how far we've already come today. In 2002, a brain researcher named William Dobell made headlines by partially restoring sight to a fully blind patient. Dobell implanted electrodes in the man's visual cortex and linked them through a portable computer to a tiny video camera mounted on the man's glasses. The result was grainy, blurred vision, but vision nonetheless. Dr. Dobell's blind patients could see well enough to drive a car around a parking lot slowly and carry out simple everyday tasks. Now, if I can put a functional artificial eye into a blind man, restoring his sight, then it's a short step, technologically speaking, to include additional features into the implanted device, for example, a telescopic lens or an infrared sensor. So now we have a formerly blind person who can not only see normally, but who can also zoom in clearly on very distant objects and see pretty well at night. He can see better than well. If this technology becomes safe and affordable, it would be remarkable if some people with normal vision did not start hankering to have their optical sensorium tweaked with a similar enhancement. Now, the major drawback of Dr. Dobell's brain-machine interface device was that it required drilling a hole into your skull and putting electrodes directly into your brain. No one's going to want to do that unless they absolutely have to. But what if you could achieve the same powerful effect non-invasively from the outside of the head? Researchers are making very rapid progress with precisely this challenge. They've developed sophisticated skull caps that you put on your head, and the caps read various kinds of activity going on in your brain: blood flow, electrical activity, electromagnetic activity. Then the skull cap transmits this information to a computer, which decodes it and translates it into corresponding commands. As of today, they've already developed skull cap technology that allows people to play computer games simply by thinking a command silently inside their own mind. You think cursor move up, the skull cap reads the corresponding activity in your brain's motor cortex. The computer cursor on the screen in front of you responds smoothly right on cue. Some people have gotten extremely good at playing video games using these kinds of skull caps, and you can Google them and watch them on YouTube. But it's not just our senses we can modify through bioelectronics. What about our minds? What about our emotions? Here, one scientist's experiments of the 1970s bear an eerie relevance. The biologist Robert Heath was working with severely depressed patients for whom no cure had worked. In one experiment, he placed electrodes directly into one of the reward centers in his patient's brain. Then he filmed his interaction with her while a technician delivered electrical stimulation to those electrodes. Here's the description. I'm reading the description of the film. A woman of indeterminate age lies on a narrow cot, a giant bandage covering her skull. At the start of the film, she seems locked inside some private vortex of despair. Her face is as blank as her white hospital gown, and her voice is a remote, tired monotone. 60 pulses, says a disembodied voice. It belongs to the technician in the next room who is sending a current to the electrodes inside the woman's head. The patient, inside her soundproof cubicle, does not hear him. Suddenly she smiles. "Why are you smiling?" asks Dr. Heath, sitting by her bedside. "I don't know. Are you doing something to me?" She giggles. "I don't usually sit around and laugh at nothing. I must be laughing at something." 140, says the off-screen technician. The patient giggles again, transformed from a stone-faced zombie into a little girl with a secret joke. "What in the hell are you doing?" she asks. "You must be hitting some goody place." So now imagine that we could achieve this kind of control over the daily flow of our inner states through a skull cap or similar device. Unlike drugs, such a device would be able to act directly on the brain centers that are associated with particular moods or abilities. It might therefore cause fewer side effects, like the jitteriness that we associate when we have too many cups of coffee. It would offer finely grained increments of effect, infinitely scalable and adjustable. Sort of crank up the volume a little bit, adjust the settings, maybe a little more calm here, a little less euphoria. It would also be quickly and easily reversible. Just push a button and the effect ceases, back to unmodified me. If a day comes when these kinds of devices become widely accessible, in other words, safe and affordable, they will offer each and every one of us potentially unlimited access to our own inner goody places. How will we respond to such a technology? Will some persons choose to retreat into their homes, to zap their own brain's pleasure centers as unrelentingly and mindlessly as the rats studied by scientists in the 1950s? Such a technology raises basic questions about human autonomy, our free will, the core element of our most intimate selfhood. What am I if I cannot exercise sovereign control over my own emotions, my own thoughts? I'm subject to being jerked to and fro from the outside by something so simple and mechanical as a series of electric pulses. And what am I if I discover that I myself can also easily exercise such direct physical control over my mind, drastically changing the most intimate states of my own subjectivity by the mere turn of a dial or push of a button? Have I become, in effect, my own puppeteer? The third major area of human enhancement is, of course, genetics. Most geneticists today believe that both nature and nurture, genes and environment, are critically important in making us who we are. Nevertheless, scientists have also discovered that by altering individual components in certain systems of genes, we can directly affect complex and intangible traits in predictable ways. So let's take intelligence and learning as an example. In 1999, the Princeton neuroscientist Joe Chen engineered a strain of transgenic mice with elevated levels of expression for a gene called NR2B. When he subjected those mice to tests of learning and memory, they performed 5 times better than unmodified mice. Chen demonstrated that the genetic intervention had augmented activity of the synaptic receptor, NMDA, in the animal's forebrains. And he attributed the striking leap in their cognitive abilities to this fact. What's striking here is that Chen did not possess nor does anyone today possess a full understanding of how mice brains work. He just tweaked the gene and the behavior, the phenotype, changed dramatically in precisely the ways that Chen had hypothesized it would. The mice became smarter. To be sure, we have no reason to believe this kind of feat will be applicable to humans anytime soon. Apart from the practical challenges, the ethical problems involved in attempting such a thing are profound. Nevertheless, the precisely targeted genetic interventions achieved by scientists like Zhou Chen suggest that we may eventually be able to do much more than just tinker around the edges of the human constitution, altering relatively minor traits like hair color. We may be able to reach far deeper, modifying some of the traits that render us most distinctively human: emotion, cognition, and character. Designer babies are very much in the news these days because of the discovery 2 years ago of a potent new method for modifying DNA, the CRISPR-Cas9 pathway for editing genomes. Biologists are very excited about the potential of this new technology because it allows for unprecedented precision and relative ease in making modifications to the DNA of all kinds of organisms ranging from plants and animals to humans themselves. Some scientists have concluded that this innovation is sufficiently powerful to warrant a moratorium on using CRISPR technology for human gene editing experiments, at least until our society has had a chance to assess the full implications. What seems to have gone unnoticed in all these debates over designer babies has been the emergence over the past decade of a separate pathway for genetic engineering that holds equally great potential for redesigning human bodies and minds, and that is epigenetics. Over the coming decades, altering your kid's DNA may not prove to be the most effective or appealing way to proceed, and thus all the hoopla over designer babies may turn out to have been misplaced. Perhaps it is designer adults created through epigenetic modification that we should be discussing. What does this relatively new scientific word mean, epigenetic? The more scientists learn about the functioning of genes, the more they have come to emphasize the crucial role played by the molecular factors that regulate genetic expression, the activation of certain segments of DNA code, the deactivation of others. It turns out that many of our 20,000 genes are constantly being switched on and off, their potency of expression being turned up or down like a volume knob in complex sequences and combinations. When scientists speak of an epigenetic process, they're referring to any of these molecular mechanisms that changes the expression of genetic information without altering the underlying DNA sequence itself. In other words, the DNA code stays the same, but certain portions of it are selectively silenced while others are spurred to action. A good analogy, I think, is that of a piano keyboard, whose keys are like the letters of DNA code. Although all the keys are always present, the nature of the actual music depends on which keys are being pressed, in what sequence, and with what pressure. In this analogy, your epigenome, the sum total of epigenetic molecular factors, your epigenome is like the pianist, playing first one tune, then another, on the keyboard of your DNA. Unlike the DNA code in your cells, which stays largely the same throughout your lifetime, your epigenetic information is constantly responding to environmental cues. This is what allows your body to adapt to the fluctuating conditions you encounter from moment to moment or place to place. You go outside from an air-conditioned building into a hot, courtyard, epigenetic processes kick in. Scientists are only just beginning to understand the intricate dance of molecular mechanism mechanisms through which epigenetic modifications take place. But as their understanding deepens, a major new vehicle for gene enhancement may gradually become available to humankind. Instead of directly modifying the underlying DNA code in our cells, we would operate indirectly, altering the epigenetic mechanisms that modulate the expression of the DNA code. The advantages of this indirect method would be significant. Epigenetic modifications would be much easier to carry out than alterations of the underlying genome, because your epigenome is already primed to respond quite sensitively to shifting environmental conditions or trigger events. These modifications could therefore be made at any point in a person's lifetime, and they would be far more flexible in nature. You could refine them over time as your knowledge of how they work became more sophisticated. You could reverse earlier changes that you made, at least some of them, undoing them, replacing them with new modifications. You could tweak, adjust, boost, upgrade at will. Epigenetic science is still too young today for us to foretell how effective an instrument it will become, whether for healing the sick or for enhancing the healthy. But if it pans out, and all the scientists I'm talking to are telling me that it is panning out very magnificently, it will probably transform the nature of genetic enhancement, allowing you to sculpt your body and mind on an ongoing basis as a lifelong project, a sort of genetic work in progress. So with these considerations in mind, drugs, bioelectronics, genetics, and epigenetics, it becomes clearer just how misleading the mainstream sci-fi depictions of the future really are. Star Wars, Star Trek, AI, Blade Runner, all these films are tacitly colluding in the choice not to see, not to allow themselves to envision the application of biotechnology to entire human populations. Yet this is precisely the reality that is gradually emerging all around us today. Humans reshaped by drugs, humans symbiotically penetrated by informatic devices, humans genetically redesigned to live longer and stronger. These are not mere figments conjured up by sci-fi writers. They are becoming real. They're coming over the horizon of the possible. And they have the power to turn our civilization upside down, most probably within the lifetimes of our children and grandchildren. This is especially true if we consider not just the technologies themselves, a pill, an implant, a gene splice, but their possible social and cultural consequences. The reconfiguration of our bodies and minds, assuming we find ways to accomplish it safely, would confront humankind with several major sets of questions. First, this is the one that Jerry mentioned earlier. Will the most potent and effective enhancements be prohibitively expensive and therefore remain accessible only to the privileged few? And if so, would this not result in a radical exacerbation of the division between haves and have-nots, inscribing that division into biology itself? Will these technologies continually raise the bar of quote-unquote normal performance, forcing all of us to engage in constant cycles of upgrades and boosts merely to keep up with the ever-rising benchmarks of species-typical capability? And the phrase here is, humans 95, humans XP, humans 10. What happens to those who refuse such enhancements? Will they become akin to obsolete technologies, hopelessly outclassed by modified humans in health, talent, dexterity, mental acuity, the ability to communicate, the ability to interact with machines? Will such unmodified humans be able to coexist alongside the modified ones? Might the widespread adoption of different enhancement packages result in increasingly distinct lineages of modified humans, sort of each lineage defined by its particular constellation or profile of chosen traits and capabilities? Could this trend ultimately culminate in the fragmentation of Homo sapiens into a series of separate successor species? If I can sculpt my moods at will, simply by choosing from a wide array of sophisticated pills or bioelectronic devices, which emotional state will constitute an authentic me? This one is more speculative. It may never come about, but if it does, it would be profoundly impactful. If I can communicate directly with you brain to brain, sharing thoughts and perhaps even memories through an implanted brain-machine interface, will this cause a blurring of the boundaries between my own sense of self and yours? Will there be genetic fads? The musical 70s, the blonde 90s? Will corporations hold patents on the enhancement packages that they offer? And will this result in a certain component of my body or mind being partially owned or legally controlled by those corporations? No, you can't upgrade that. That's proprietary. We have to. What will war be like? What new forms of violence might we expect in a world of physically and mentally enhanced soldiers and of similarly enhanced, of course, criminals and terrorists? If people live healthy and mentally vigorous lives that span 130 years or 160 years or perhaps longer, what impact will this have on marriage and the family? You stand before the altar and you say, I do, and now you're committing to 130 years more together. What effect will it have on population levels and ecological pressures? On work and intergenerational relations? On the stages of life and our sense of our lifespan's meaning and purpose? How will parents cope with the momentous decisions and trade-offs involved in partially designing their offspring's traits? What about if the two spouses cannot agree? You sort of say, well, you do this kid, I'll do the next one. What would it be like, conversely, to know that your parents had sat down for that little design session in the months before you were conceived? This is if you're going with the designer baby idea, not the epigenetic idea. Would you wonder over time if your achievements really belong to you or were merely products of the engineering carried out on you by someone else before you were born? So, for example, let's say I'm very good at the piano. But now I ask myself, is this really my own achievement, or is it merely because I was designed to be good at the piano? Was I designed to develop into precisely the kind of person who loves practicing and playing the piano? There's a major issue lying latent here in all these questions. I sum it up with the word commodification. It has to do with starting to think of a human person as a kind of product or a commodity. When I talk about the re-engineering of human traits, it's striking how often I find myself using metaphors involving products and commodities. I find myself speaking of the installation of gene packages, of different versions and models, of the need for upgrades. This kind of language is hard to avoid because biotechnological modifications are inherently product-like in nature. They require machines, chemicals, tools, and techniques that steadily advance in sophistication over time. They become obsolete after a certain number of years. They are or will be available for purchase on the open market. Some will be better than others, more expensive than others. Some, like cars or jewelry or your house, will confer much greater prestige than others, social status. People will tend to categorize each other according to the kinds of modifications they have made to their body and mind. In this way, we can easily find ourselves forgetting that these quote-unquote products are in fact altering key aspects of a real human being's selfhood. Without realizing it, we drift into an instrumental mode of thought. We reduce a person to the sum total of her modified or unmodified traits. We lose sight of the person's intrinsic value and dignity. It was precisely this kind of dehumanizing slippage that vitiated the thinking of eugenicists in the first half of the 20th century, in this country and in Europe, and other parts of the world as well, with catastrophic consequences. If human bioenhancement becomes widespread during the coming decades, we have every reason to expect that this danger will return, and probably on a much broader scale than we saw in the first half of the 20th century. The tendency for people to speak casually about getting an upgrade or choosing a better model will be strong. Insofar as large numbers of people start perceiving themselves and other people in this commodified way, our society runs a risk that cannot be overstated. This is the kind of thinking that inherently dehumanizes people, distances them from each other, degrades their sense of each other's fundamental worth. When it operates in the mind, it converts other human beings into pawns, forces, objects to be thrown away. In this sense, it provides the logical linchpin of a worldview that ultimately allows people to perpetrate abominations on each other without batting an eye. And so confronting this terrible risk and counteracting it with effective cultural strategies of rehumanization, this will pose one of the most important moral challenges facing our civilization. So I'll sum up. For me, what primarily stands out from all this is the human ability to intervene in areas that once lay utterly beyond our reach. These are, without a doubt, Frankenstein powers, the capability to model human flesh and soul according to our wishes or whims. Go to a doctor, get a prescription, take a pill, and the familiar contours of our identity melt away. We become someone new, someone different, more closely aligned with our desires. Dr. Frankenstein's creation, as Mary Shelley envisioned him, was a solitary experiment, a unique exemplar of an engineered human being. And this rendered him a kind of a freak, monster. But these Frankenstein powers of today, they won't just be applied to one person in isolation. They will be all around us, adopted by millions, perhaps billions of people. For many among us, they will form part of our very own individual selfhood. What happens when the majority of people in our society are engineered beings? The fact that people like you and me are acquiring such powers, what will this mean for us? If I can mold my own appearance, defy the aging process, boost my physical traits to unimagined heights, who am I? If I can ratchet up my cognition to levels beyond anything I'd ever dreamed, if I can partially control my emotional states, fine-tuning the flow of feelings as they wash over me through the hours of the day, who am I? Am I a human, a machine, a product, a demigod? Am I debased or transcendent? I don't know the answers to these questions, but my argument today has been primarily this. Over the coming decades, you yourselves, your children, your grandchildren will almost certainly face such questions all the time, just in the course of living your everyday lives. I'll stop there, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and questions.
So we have about 15 minutes for questions. If you'd like to ask Dr. Bess a question, he's delighted to take them. If you just stand in front of either mic and wait to be called on, that would be great.
Hello, my name is Mark G. I'm a student here, and I'd like to point out one exception to your popular media theory. There's 7 Eves. It's a book talking about genetic modification and also speciation of the entire human race.
Is that the Neil Stephenson
Yes.
novel?
Yep.
So it's on my shelf. I haven't read it yet.
Okay. Well, I'd suggest you read it. It was good. But the question I wanted to ask is the situation evolves pretty much everyone decides for themselves. And they make their own decisions. They create their own lines, which eventually become these different species.
Yes.
And here you've talked about equal value, equal worth.
Right.
Which seems like very much a cooperative concept, a shared societal value.
Yes.
How would you foster that as opposed to this 7 Eves version of speciation?
I would foster it by trying to, I guess, get people to understand what are the implications of living in a society that has undergone speciation. Everything that we hold dear in a democratic society is predicated on fundamental equal worth. One citizen, one vote. If we lose that, and people start falling into these categories, that the way we categorize commodities and products, and people start slipping into that, we lose equality before the law. We lose most of the things that we have come to hold very dear and precious in the way we structure our ethical systems, but also our political systems over the past, millennia. It would be a radical degradation of a form of progress that one can discern in human history up until this point. It's debatable whether the progress is certainly not a uniform process, and it's certainly not inevitable. And if we go down this path, I believe that it would be a regression of the worst sort. I think if the only strategies I have for that is for people to understand what's at stake. And to understand when you start to think about other people this way, that's the path down which you're going. That has to be put into our educational systems, which means we have to get behind it as citizens and insist that that's the way our educational systems and our society get structured. See, I'll go over there and come back over here.
Sorry. So in our discussion on pharmaceuticals and genetic modification, what are your opinions and thoughts on the black market and the potential for an underground human development?
Well, there would be presumably an underground, if there were that tremendous disparity in prices, and if you tried to ban certain types of bioenhancement technologies, you could expect something similar to what happened in Prohibition, where there would be illicit forms. So I'm predicating, my model is predicated on bioenhancement technologies coming into a society something like what our society is like today, that these would not be technologies that would be offered by the state the way it was conceived in the first half of the 20th century. It was the state trying to just make these eugenic choices and shaping the citizenry according to the ideas of a few leaders. That obviously was discredited because that culminated in the Holocaust. But this more liberal form of eugenics, it's now becoming more, people people of a libertarian bent say, I have a right to modify myself any way I want. And people are saying parents have a right, to educate their children any way they want. Well, we have a right to modify our children. That's a familial right. And so people are using libertarian-type arguments to say we should be able to do this without any governmental regulation. And I disagree I disagree because I believe that our society can come together to make laws that protect certain moral structures that are absolutely essential to things that we hold dear, like democracy. So I do believe that regulation is necessary as we go down this path.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for a stimulating talk. I was thinking as I was listening to your presentation, a couple of things, and I would love to know what you thought about them.
Yeah.
One is that you were sort of contrasting the future of modified humans with a kind of present or past, perhaps, where there were unmodified humans.
Yes,
And
relatively unmodified.
And I wondered if it was really ever true that there were unmodified humans. Haven't humans always modified ourselves throughout history, whether it's
Right.
foot binding or corsets or wigs
Glasses.
or powder or glasses
Right.
or, we've always modified our moods through various kinds of drugs, ritually some kinds. So, everything you mention are literally things we've always done.
Right.
And in some ways, aren't you falling into some ways the actual pattern you yourself are describing of really not really thinking enough of how different the future could be? In some ways, you're describing the present. We already have interventions by parents that exacerbate inequalities tremendously
Yes.
among people, right? The people who are excellent pianists, by and large, are people whose parents invested in giving them piano lessons.
Yeah.
The same with, Kuban or whatever the various technologies in education technologies are that
Yes.
we provide to our children. So what I'm just really saying is this future that you're depicting really so far away? It just sort of sounds like the present to me. We already have people on their cell phones stimulating their goodie center. We know what the future looks like. We see it.
Yeah.
I was at actually a Trevor Noah speech, and everyone took out their phone immediately, and he said, it's nice to meet your phone. When people say to you, what was he like in person, you'll say, I don't know, because I wasn't looking at my phone. So we already know what that looks like.
Yes.
So my question is this future, isn't it just the present, really?
Well, that's a wonderful question. I think what you're saying is definitely true. We have been modifying ourselves to varying degrees ever since, there's signs of decoration and tattooing going way back, and people have been discovering that certain plants produce certain effects. And what I would say, I would draw a real qualitative line with what's coming over the horizon in terms of the potency and the directness and the no side effects of these instruments that are now being developed for modifying human bodies and minds. Education, putting on glasses, drinking a cup of coffee, these are blunt instruments, and in the case of education, they happen very slowly and gradually. But if I put on a skull cap or a headset that uses transcranial magnetic stimulation and zaps a certain part of my brain, I don't have any control. That's going to just make me do things differently. And that's an instant, powerful, precise, in some cases, synaptic level or molecular level intervention. The potency of these changes, of these capabilities, when there comes a point where a whole bunch of small quantitative differences add up and become a qualitative leap. And I think I can make a case that we are entering a qualitatively different era in terms of power that we'll have. The point that you're making about this, a lot of these problems are already present in our society today, I agree with. I lament them just as you do, but I believe these things are going to make them much worse. And so that's my worry. I'm not saying we shouldn't do these things. I'm not saying reject all bioenhancement. But I guess the one conclusion that I come to at the end of all this is, let's slow down. What's the big hurry? Now, obviously, if you're trying to run a mile faster than everybody else, you're in a hurry to do that. And there's this powerful impetus. Partly it may be greed that propels us, personal greed, I want to run a mile faster and get the gold medal, but it could also be parents wanting the best for their children. So it could tap into the very best motivations that we have. But all of this is going to propel us to go faster and faster and faster. And my concern is, these changes could come so fast that they could turn our society upside down and disrupt the structures that stabilize things profoundly. The Industrial Revolution made a huge impact on the way people lived, and it took about a century and a half, 2 centuries, to exert its impact. I'd like to see that kind of time span, not just decades. And so my feeling is, let's slow down, let's be careful, let's look at what the impacts are, let's live with these things for a while, and then take another step, and then look. And now, obviously, that's a hard sell in a society where everyone is trying to go faster and faster. But that's what I think is the wiser path.
Thank you so much. This has been really interesting. So I was listening to a podcast the other day. It was about artificial intelligence, and just like this, there are catastrophic consequences to that as well. Now the thing is, the person in the podcast said that we need to take a proactive approach to artificial intelligence versus a reactive approach. I think we need to do this for biogenetics as well.
Yeah.
Do you think we are taking enough of a proactive approach as a society? If yes, how are we? If not, how do you think we should be doing that?
Yeah, no, we are not taking enough of a proactive approach to either to biotechnology being applied to human bodies and minds, bioengineering, or to the AI problem. I think a lot more resources need to go into both. Making AI reliably beneficial is a huge problem. And 3-4 decades down the line may be too late. And the same thing applies to these modifications that I'm talking about. So how do we go about that? I think you have to, this is what has come to be known in social science as a wicked problem. A wicked problem is like, how do you change the educational system? Well, it turns out that in order to change the educational system, you need more money, and you need a different attitude among the parents, and you need better schools, and so you need different tax structures, and you need political will. So it's a multi-pronged problem where if you just try to attack it from any one angle, you'll fail. You'll be frustrated. And so you have to, since it's a multifaceted problem, you have to tackle it simultaneously from multiple angles and different levels at the same time, which is wickedly difficult to do in an effective way. But I don't see any other solution to, how do we tackle the safe AI? How do we become wiser in handling these very powerful technologies? I see that as both of those as wicked problems. And we need to operate at many, many levels at the same time. So one level is education. I think humanists need to be rendered much more exposed to and sensitive to what's going on in the science and technology. Scientists and technologists need to be much more aware of the ethical implications of what they're doing. Some of them are, but not all of them. And we can be systematic about this. We can be proactive about how we set this up. So that's the educational component. And I think it needs to move all the way down into the high schools and the elementary school level. And hopefully then there will generate the political will to maybe put some regulatory bodies in power. There used to be a body called the Office of Technology Assessment that was housed in the Congress and advised legislators of both parties, it was sort of a nonpartisan body, about the implications, the long-term implications of various science and technology developments that were happening, saying to the legislators, if you do this, then these will probably be the consequences down the line. And that was abolished in the early 1990s. We need an agency like that. Those are some of the things that I think we could start doing.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
So to follow on that, does our political leadership have the wherewithal to conduct the forward thinking that's necessary to avoid the worst aspects of what you envision?
Yeah, I'm writing a book about this now, and I feel sometimes like all I have to do is look at the news and then say, not that. Don't do what we're doing. So then the question becomes, how do we, I think the only answer is we're still a democracy. You know, the Russians have their say, but we're still a democracy. We still ultimately, if we can spread the word among ourselves, we have made some very powerful changes to the way we structure our lives morally. I was showing my students a World War II video the other day. I teach a class on World War II. The language that was used to describe the Japanese was, the students were horrified. And these were US government, why we're fighting this war. And I said, look, it's been 70 odd years. Look how much change was brought about by the civil rights movement, by the women's movement. So we have that power. And I don't see any other path to changing the political scene unless we do it from below as citizens, one together, organizing ourselves and spreading the word and demanding then that the politicians enact wiser policies. It's a tall order. There's maybe a little doom in that, I guess. Yes.
Yes. First of all, thank you for coming and giving this lovely talk. Second, I'd like to commend your artist over here for doing a wonderful job turning talk into a microcosm graphic. Looks great.
I've been blown away by those things all day. I'm totally enjoying those.
Well, my question it's somewhat related to the previous gentleman's question. It has to do with this technology and our way of life has drastically changed over the course of human history. I mean, the graphic about life expectancy is proof enough.
Yeah.
Now, our political system in this country, anyway, for the most part, has changed fundamentally, basically not at all. Now, with this emerging technology, how do we leave these incredibly morally ambiguous questions up? Who should we let make these decisions about where to draw the line about what it means to be human and what's okay and what's not?
Okay, so that's a really tough question because, and I don't have a good answer for that one. When I talk about the problem of the exacerbation of the rich and poor gap, okay, what I'm implicitly saying is the solution is going to have to be, some sort of like what they do in Sweden or Switzerland, where they subsidize equal access. In Europe, they subsidize equal access to health care and education. So my thought was, well, we'll have to do the same thing. We'll have to have a social welfare system that subsidizes, gives the option to people, not the requirement, but the option to people to get subsidized bioenhancements so that they can keep up with their wealthier fellow citizens. So then the government is getting involved in funding. They're going to have to say, well, no, you can't add a tail to your body. That's not a bioenhancement that we're going to fund. But you can boost your cognition by 10 points, 10 IQ points. Suddenly the government is back in the eugenics business. How do we avoid that? I don't know. Isn't that like cheating on your test? Yeah. To bioenhance your cognition? Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Yeah, for some reason, like taking those types of cognitive enhancer chemicals in college is not morally frowned on like cheating on a test so far. And that's interesting. I have students who have gone to Wall Street and they tell me, the younger members of the firm take my students who are applicants to the firm aside and say, we work 70 to 80-hour weeks. And what's your cognitive enhancer chemical of choice? Because if you're not cognitively enhancing yourself, you're a slacker. We don't want you. It's somehow not only become not considered cheating, it's considered required in some circles. I suspect that that's going to, I don't like it, but I suspect that that's going to keep expanding. I didn't really fully answer your question. I don't have a good answer to how the government can do this without getting back in the eugenics business. But I don't see a good outcome without some kind of government regulation. It looks like you had something you wanted to add.
if the government gets involved, then obviously they'll start using tax money, and people aren't even willing to use their tax money to pay for anything. People just don't like paying taxes, period.
Right. Yeah, and so people don't want to become Sweden. All I can say on that one is I think Sweden has worked something out there, and the choice is going to be pretty stark. It's not just within one nation. What's going to happen between, when you look at from the rich nations to the poor nations? On a global scale, we're going to end up with a fragmented species unless we find some way to do a global Marshall Plan or something to make sure that everybody has the option of doing the bioenhancements. Otherwise, it's just going to be the rich nations or the rich people within the rich nations, and you're going to have that divide. Are we running out of time?
What I'm going to do, we'll take two more questions. I'm just making an editorial decision here. And I know Dr. Bess will stick around if there's people that want to talk to him privately afterwards. That will be fine. We'll take two more questions right now.
All right.
One from either side.
All right.
All right, thank you. My question is somewhat related to earlier questions about the historical view, perhaps.
Yes.
And I'm curious, you've spoken a lot about the innovations and potentially disruptive consequences of these innovations. I'm curious what historical continuities you see between previous eugenicist projects and the way that we talk about body modification and enhancements or diseases from autism to obesity to other things like that.
Wonderful question. We could talk for 3 hours about that. So I think we have become, as a society, far more sensitive to the degrading forms of stereotypes and packaging and bundling of people and saying, oh, you're blind, therefore you have to do a certain kind of job and not this other kind of job. We're in the first half of the 20th century, it was fairly common to just lump people into these categories. We've learned a lot, but I see a very real possibility of, like I said in the talk, of a sort of creeping commodification of humans. And that worries me. That has already been a trend. It's kind of like you said earlier. We've been doing this. Some people have been lording it over others and considering themselves superior to others. We had aristocrats and commoners. But the difference was, in the end, the aristocrats and the commoners were biologically the same. Ultimately, you could end up being an aristocrat and being very stupid. You could be a commoner and be very smart. There wasn't much social mobility, so you still had the deck stacked against you as a commoner. In the world that I'm envisioning, if it goes like this, it's not going to be fixable. It's going to be truly different castes, and those castes are going to be biologically inscribed. We can't let that happen. How we prevent that, that's a big challenge. I don't know the answer. I can only sort of talk about education and political mobilization and the kinds of things that we can do to try to build the sort of social order we want. I don't have a good answer, and I'm frustrated by that. I will say that I'm heartened when I talk to young people. Talking to old people, I get pessimistic. Talking to young people, I see so much goodwill and so many good ideas. So, maybe I should just talk to more young people.
Hi, again, thank you. I'm
Sure.
swirling with questions.
Okay.
Firstly, the big one that I was thinking of is if we are looking at the possible futures and where technology might take us, and we're making these judgments about what's good, what's unrecognizable, what's bad,
Yeah.
and et cetera. I guess my question is sort of related to earlier questions, being that throughout time and throughout history, our societal-wide sense of right and wrong, albeit our morality,
Yeah.
has continued to change.
Yeah.
So standing here in 2017, making judgments about what's good and bad in 2070, I guess, how do we see our morality as a society progressing with technology?
Yes.
And then, yeah.
That's an excellent question. And how do we presume to speak for the generation of the year 2500, right? The metaphor I use there is when you're applying, when you're in high school and you're applying to college, you know somewhere, you're thinking ahead, you're 18 years old, 17 years old, and you're thinking ahead, you know that this college experience is going to change you profoundly. But you still have to make a decision about, well, what kind of person am I now? And what kind of trajectory do I envision for myself in choosing the school that's going to be the right fit for me? And I know that when I go to that school, it's going to transform me in ways that I can't predict. But you're making a wager based on your constellation of values now, and you're making a wager about what kind of path I'm hoping to follow and what kind of moral and psychological and character evolution I believe is the right one to pursue, with the full knowledge that at the end of the journey, I'll be a different person, maybe and I'll be making maybe different decisions down the line. I think this is what allows us to have a certain confidence, nonetheless, in making provisional moral decisions for our generation and not worrying, saying when 2070, they can make different decisions. But right now, thinking in terms of moral trajectories, where do we want to go as a society? Where do I want to go as an individual? But where do we want? What kind of society? What kind of social order do we want to be? But also, what kind of social order do we very much not want to become? And what sorts of steps do we need to take to block that from happening? And I think we're probably better at figuring out what we don't want to have happen in some ways.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you all.